Hackenbracht hits high at Carnage. VDL voyages on. Tournament Tyro takes Tempest. For the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, I'm David Hood, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, November 2020. For our feature story, tournament or league diplomacy differs from pickup games in one very important way. The games have a scoring system. While such systems have changed a great deal over the decades and are frequently the subject of much controversy and debate, good diplomacy players figure out how to adapt their play in order to achieve success under whatever scoring system is in use. Later, we will hear from a panel of experts about how to make good gameplay decisions under such systems as Tribute, Carnage, or Dixicon, while staying true to one's own diplomacy style. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Bill Hackenbracht of North Carolina has won the 2020 Carnage Diplomacy Tournament, held November 6th through 8th. Bill's England conquered the top board of an innovative four-round event structure, which involved two games beginning at 10 a.m. Eastern using Carnage scoring, and two other games with 10 p.m. starts Eastern using Bangkok scoring. Tournament director Dave Maletsky also organized a currency game for each country to be invested to run parallel to the top board, as well as opening ceremonies to include a free online concert. The remainder of the top board included Ed Sullivan, Farron Jane, Nicholas Sahuge, Adam Siegel, Ben Kelman, and Chris Brand. You can find the full coverage of all four rounds, plus the top board, on the DBN YouTube channel. The idea was from Russ Dennis of the Diplomacy Briefing newsletter, an online game on Backstabber featuring players from 7 different diplomacy content creators, with accompanying videos and other programming to be produced about the game. Thus was born the Media Wars game, completed a few weeks ago. Brother Board, famous for his blog and video series discussing the strategy, tactics, and negotiation skills of both Classic Dip and of Gunboat, topped the Media Wars board as Germany, besting Ed Sullivan from the Diplomats podcast series, Randy Thompson from the Legendary Tactics YouTube channel, Village Idiot from the Diplomacy Briefing, Ambi from the Diplomacy Games podcast, Marka Zelstra from Diplostrats on YouTube, and the Diplomacy Broadcast Network's own Zachary Moore. You can read or watch complete coverage of this special online media event at the sites or channels for each of these DBN media partners. This is likely the most talked about diplomacy game of all time, so don't miss it. The Potomac Tea and Knife Society, the D.C. area's longtime diplomacy club, hosted its Tempest in a Teapot tournament in October, and Andrei Gribikov of California came out ahead, playing in only his second diplomacy tournament ever. He topped both his boards as England and then as Russia. This two-round event was directed by veteran player David Miller and used Carnage scoring. Coming in positions 2nd through 7th were Karthik Koneth, Bill Hackenbracht, Hunter Catcher, Jackson Roberts, Farron Jane, and Natty Schaefer. Catch DBN's wrap-up show, full live coverage of both rounds, and separate videos of each game at our YouTube and Twitch channels. The popular diplomacy website and app Diplicity has added yet another variant to its offerings, this one entitled 1908 Fall of Europe. While similar to Classic Dip, this variant adds additional supply centers in North Africa and Central Europe, makes Switzerland a passable supply center, and makes other subtle changes to the stalemate lines by adding extra non-center provinces in key locations. 1908 joins the other 15 variants available on Diplicity to go along with the several variants now available on the other commercially produced diplomacy Android app Conspiracy, not to mention those available on Web Diplomacy and Play Diplomacy. V-Diplomacy has a whopping total of over 120 variant titles to choose from. There is also a variant Diplomacy Club channel now on Discord. Flex your diplomacy muscles in a new way. Try a variant. The Virtual Diplomacy League held another full day of competition on October 24, with the 5 full boards played on 2 different start times. Players hailed from all over the world, with the top 5 finishers including Alessandro Tavani of Italy, John Anderson from Utah, British Columbia's own Liam Stokes, a shared board top between Dave Roberts of Washington and Jim Fan of California, and another with Miles Holcomb of Australia and Hal Shield of Virginia. With only 2 VDL game days remaining before the championship game to be played in January, time is running out for you to get involved in the first season of this exciting new way to play diplomacy. Sign up now for the November 21 VDL games, which will have start times of 2 a.m., 9 a.m., and 4 p.m., all Central Time, and all available now on the Virtual Diplomacy League Discord server. One reason to sign up for VDL games is that the winner of the Virtual Diplomacy League will get a coveted automatic berth into the first ever Diplomacy Broadcast Network Invitational Tournament, Diplomacy's Big Dance, to be held virtually in February 2021. The field will eventually consist of 28 top diplomacy players, including the winners of all qualifying league and tournament events for this year, with the remainder of the spots to be filled with those players ranked high enough in the DBNI standings. Doing well in your virtual games from now until the end of the qualifying season will give you a shot at one of those at-large berths. You can check out the latest standings for the DBNI at our website, diplobn.com. 9 dippers have already punched their automatic tickets to the Invitational. See if you can join them. In addition to the VDL, register for the upcoming virtual World Diplomacy Classic in December and the Cascadia Tournament on January 30. The final board for Season 5 of the Nexus Online Tournament is off and running. Nexus brings together online players from all the usual platforms, including Web Diplomacy, Play Diplomacy, Backstabber, Conspiracy, V-Diplomacy, Dip Bounced, and Diplicity to crown a seasoned champ after multiple preliminary rounds. This year's event features a collection of well-known online superstars, some up-and-comers, and even a well-known face-to-face former world champion. You can get up to speed on this championship event through DBN's special pregame show available on this same DBN channel, as well as a series of videos of the Diplomats series of podcasts on YouTube, which include commentary from experts, including Umble the Heap, which is Russ Dennis of the Diplomacy Briefing newsletter, and Ed Sullivan, known online as Go Horns Go. Sign-ups for Season 6 of the Nexus Tournament are available now on the Nexus Discord channel. For decades in our hobby, diplomacy games were run by mail and then by email with human GMs rather than through the website-based engines of today. One option for playing in games run with a human GM is now back on the table because the Diplomatic Corps has refurbished its website and is welcoming new players. In addition to Classic Dip, a number of variants are available for play on Diplomatic Corps. Check it out at diplomaticcorps.com. There are still some traditional diplomacy zines out there as well, in which the publisher runs games himself, perhaps the most well-known example being Doug Kent's Eternal Sunshine, which began as a postal zine in the old days, but which just published its 137th issue on the web last month. You can find Doug's zine at whiningkentpigs.com. The next tournament on the diplomacy calendar is the virtual World Diplomacy Classic, a live diplomacy tournament held December 18 through 20, 2020, with gameplay on Backstabber.com and player interactions conducted through voice on Discord. The organizer, Bill Hackenbracht, will share tournament director responsibilities with hobby notables Chris Brand, Peter McNamara, Marcus Zelstra, and Gary Sturley. This international cast of characters, who have each volunteered to run a round friendly to their respective time zones, will facilitate maximum world participation. The 5 preliminary rounds are currently scheduled, using the Eastern time zone for guidance, for Friday at 12 noon and 8 p.m., and then Saturday at 3 a.m. 11 a.m., and 8 p.m., with players allowed to play up to 4 of these 5 rounds. The top board will then begin 12 noon that Sunday, December the 20th. For more information, visit liberty-cup.com/world-diplomacy-classic, or just join the VWDC Discord channel. Now, let's turn to our feature story. The goal in diplomacy is to capture 18 supply centers, what we call the solo. Unlike in many board games, though, that rulebook victory condition is very hard to obtain in diplomacy against experienced competition. Most games end in some sort of declared draw, in which the surviving players vote to end the game with no solo winner, or perhaps the game ends automatically at a particular time or game year. How then do our tournaments and leagues score such games in determining the player standings? Why, using a scoring system, of course. Understanding and successfully navigating the various scoring systems used in our hobby can be a challenge for any diplomacy players, but never fear. The Diplomacy Broadcast Network is here to help. We have assembled a panel of 3 hobbyists to help explain the systems that have been used so far in the 2020 virtual tournaments, and to provide insight on how players can or should operate under each one. Our panelists include former world champion Doug Moore of Oregon, prolific virtual face-to-face player and scoring system analyst Karthik Koneth of California, and frequent tournament winner David Miller of Maryland, who recently served as director of the Tempest virtual face-to-face tournament held in October. So, Doug, let's start with you and the system used both events this year, Carnage scoring. Doug, if you could briefly describe that system to us, and then tell us the most important thing to consider when playing under Carnage.
Thanks, David. Carnage is a deceptively simple scoring system. In Carnage, it's functionally a lead-based scoring system. The person who finishes in first place gets 7,000 points, second place 6,000 points, and so on and so forth. And so the 7th place player on that specific board gets 1,000 points. Now, what's really interesting about the scoring system is because it divides things into those tiers, in order to match somebody who similarly has a first place, you also need to get a first place. So the goal with the Carnage system is really to encourage people to play to top a board or to get to a solo, because the advantage is so substantial. And speaking of a solo, under the Carnage scoring system, you take all the points, and no combination of scores under a Carnage system will equal a solo. So if one player solos, they will win that tournament unless somebody else can match them. So I say it's deceptively simple because it looks simple, but in practice, it's pretty complicated. And it really requires a lot of thought during the game to make sure that you're trying to get to your desired result. And it does end up with a lot of board splits in practice, because that lead is so substantial if you top a board. That's been my experience anyway.
David, how do you adapt your play when you're playing under Carnage?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think when you're playing under Carnage, the main thing is to, one, have a good ally, good person to work with at the beginning of the game, but also to make sure that you don't let them get ahead of you. It can be very difficult, I find, in a game if you have an ally who starts getting a few centers ahead of you to ever catch up to them, unless there's some opportunity for a good stab. So I think when I play Carnage, I look around the table and I try to find someone I know I can work with, and someone who maybe I think I might be able to outpace a little bit.
So, Karthik, you've played under Carnage versus some other systems. What difference in play style have you seen between people playing under Carnage versus something else?
Sure. So in Carnage and Tribute, I would say are probably the 2 systems I played under the most. In Carnage, I've noticed a willingness to share a board, and generally with the same ally you began with at the beginning of that game. Because as David said and as Doug said, they generally like to find a solid ally they can trust and work with, resolve their side of the board with them, and then split maybe like, a 9 or 10 center board top. And in doing so, get a pretty good score of 6,500 and then 9 or 10 points as the tiebreaker. Whereas in Tribute, the incentives are a little bit differently. In Tribute, you generally want to get that domination bonus. You want to have a solo board top because that's how you get huge point bonuses. Now, what I've noticed in playing it a lot is people tend to be more scared of giving up that point bonus than desiring going for it themselves. So I've seen, despite the incentives, in some games, some people would rather go for the shared board top, when in reality it's far more beneficial to go for the solo board top, even at the expense of stabbing your ally, burning bridges, or whatever. But at least as far as I've seen, the incentive structure in Tribute generally incentivizes you to play more aggressively, whereas in Carnage, I feel like you are generally more incentivized to play a game where you are in position to stay ahead of your ally, but not to the same degree as in Tribute.
Karthik, let me stay with you then. For those watching this that may have not played under Tribute before, could you briefly describe that system for us?
Sure. So basically, it's a system that attempts to maximize the points that you get based off of a few factors. One is domination, and then the other is going to be the number of supply centers you own. So you get 1 point for every single supply center you own, and then you get a series of tribute points that you take from other people based off of how many centers you have more than 6. So for every center you have more than 6, you get 1 extra point from every other player in the game until you take them down to 0 points from the tribute bonus.
Doug, you were one of the commentators for the Weaselmoot top board for DBN commentators, which was using the Tribute scoring system. Weaselmoot uses Tribute, or used Tribute, and the Virtual Diplomacy League used Tribute. What insights can you give our viewers from you watching how that played out on the top board at Weaselmoot?
Well, for Weaselmoot as a whole, I didn't really notice a substantial difference in play because of the top board mechanic. So whoever tops the top board is going to win. So there wasn't as much incentive for people to really take advantage of Tribute's unique sort of bonus for topping the board. So topping the board under any circumstance in that would have been enough to win. What I did see throughout the course of the general tournament actually echoes a lot what Karthik said with regard to people playing a little more conservatively than you would expect. I think people were more worried about what might happen if someone else got to a big lead than they were if they got themselves out to a big lead. And they were really focused on making the top board and getting decent results, and they were in getting a standout result in a lot of instances. So I'm not sure that the incentives were properly taken advantage of by the players, I would say.
Do you think that was because of lack of familiarity with the system, or do you think it was some kind of unintended consequence of the system, or something else even?
Good question. I'm not sure. I think we'd have to see more games in order to determine that. Certainly, people are not very familiar with the system, and it's a little, the mechanics require a little bit more thought than I think Carnage does, for example. So I would, let's give it a little bit more time and see how things shake out.
David, what do you think? You've seen play under Tribute. What else do you have to contribute for our viewers?
Yeah, I've seen play under Tribute, and I've played under Tribute, and I think there's a few things going on here. One, we seem to have an expectation that the scoring system is going to dramatically change how people play. I think it adds some nuance to the games, and I think it changes the mid and late game a bit. Most of the early game, it doesn't matter what system you're on, you're playing very similarly. You're trying to get into a good position, maybe get an ally, and have a plan of where you're going to go. The difference I've seen with Tribute, especially I played one of the VDL games and I've watched a few, is that in Carnage, you might have an ally, you're on 8, he's on 7. I'm pretty confident, depending on the player, that unless he thinks or she thinks they may solo, they're probably not going to stab me for 1 center near the end of the game. Under Tribute, even in the mid game, I start, getting very wary of, okay, do they think they can slide into Belgium and then patch it up so that they can now be the board topper, which is a massive difference in points. From my perspective in Carnage, people might call it more of a Care Bear system, but to me, it's the value of the stab is only really there to take the solo of a big stab, where if you can get a second place or a shared top and you're still in pretty good in the position in the tournament, whereas tribute changes the value of a stab. Even a small stab can have dramatic changes in the results.
Karthik, do you agree with that?
I think I do. I think, but I would disagree in part. I think what tribute does, in addition to incentivizing those early mid-game stabs, is sort of change the dynamism of the game. I think it encourages a more fluid style of alliance play, whereas Carnage seems to encourage people to play the sort of Care Bear style David described. I think tribute at its core is meant to, and in some cases does, encourage people to shift alliances as is best for them and to play in a very self-interested style. And in some cases, I have seen that where people who are normally Care Bears do play significantly more aggressively, I think significantly more strategically in tribute-based games than they would in Carnage-based games.
Well, that's interesting. David, let's talk about the third system that's been used. And it was used in the first virtual event of our 2020 circuit this year, and that's DixieCon. And that's an event where you yourself were the face-to-face winner in both 2018 and 2019. So you must understand how to succeed under the DixieCon scoring system. So give us a brief explanation of the system and then give us some pointers for our viewers.
Sure. DixieCon, it's a wonderful tournament. If you haven't been, I would say head down to Dixieland down in North Carolina. David Hood puts on a great event. Dixie's scoring system is a draw-based system, which in North America, very few tournaments, at least in the half dozen years I've been playing, use a draw-based system. Basically, the people in the draw split a number of points for the game. So 2 people would have a higher draw point total than 3 people because you're splitting up the points. So the advantage there is to reduce the size of the draw as much as possible. People can also what we call vote themselves out of the draw. So maybe you're the 4th player and you have 1 dot and you know you die. You might say, look, guys, just draw. Take the points. I'll just take my bonus points. And in addition to the draw points, there are 4 points for every supply center, which people often overlook, but tournaments I think have been won and lost with those extra centers. And again, a solo, well, not uncatchable like in Carnage. If you solo and no one else does in the tournament, you're pretty likely to win the entire tournament. They'd have to have 2 extremely strong, like 2-way draw, with 17 center type results to catch you. I think in terms of play, I'm torn a bit. People I've heard criticize it as a Care Bear kind of system. You pick your ally, you try to get to the stalemate line and get your 3-way draw. I do actually think there's a lot of very interesting strategic and tactical play in draw-based scoring that I sometimes feel like I'm missing in some of the other systems, where I might be England at the beginning of the game. I actually might go spend a lot of time with Turkey or spend a lot of time with Italy early on, because when you get to that point where you might have 2-on-2 and everyone wants the 3-way draw, there's a lot of diplomacy that goes into that, a lot of strategy, and of course, some very important tactics that tend to occur in the switch from mid to late game, where you might be trying to eliminate that 4th player. In a system like Tribute or Carnage, you don't need to eliminate that player. If they have fewer dots than you, it really won't make a big impact on the score. So there's a different kind of emphasis on just having the most centers versus, can I get myself to be in a smaller draw? A 8-center 3-way where someone else has a 14-center 3-way can still be a tournament-winning result if you can follow up with a better result later.
I should say, for those viewers who are primarily online players, the draw-based systems that are used in online play are what are called Draw Includes All Survivors, or DAIS. That was done away with in the face-to-face world 25 years ago or more. So when you hear draw-based system in the face-to-face world, we're talking about draws where it does not include all survivors if that vote passes, as you said, David. Doug, you yourself have conquered the DixieCon field in 2004, in 2007, and 2011, so you must know some secrets also, so tell us what they are.
Well, I think the first thing, David, is that people need to consider that there's a drop round. And a lot of people forget that when they play at DixieCon, because it's not just about the scoring system. You're going to play 3 rounds. and your worst result, you're going to drop. So I think a lot of people really make a big mistake when they go to Dixie and they're like, I'm just going to settle into my three-way draw. Actually, what I try to do is avoid locking myself into a complete alliance where, you know, I'm England and France and we're going to roll this board, but instead work really hard to not be the odd person out in my sector of the board. So in that example, if I'm France, I want to get England and Germany to fight so I could take both of them out and then open myself up to a solo opportunity if it's there. And if it's not, settle in for a good draw. And it's really, really critical to recognize that a big four-way draw is still worse than a smaller three-way draw. I've had a 17 center or a 16 center four-way draw where I had 16 centers and my score was still worse than somebody who had 9 centers in a three-way draw. So at the end of the game, if you're going for a solo, you know, and you're not going to get there, it is advantageous to actually surrender dots to the other side of the board to condense that draw size. So strategically and tactically, that's what I really focus on when I play at DixieCon, is not locking myself into an alliance immediately, but knowing that eventually, if I'm not going to solo, I will settle into something along those lines.
I guess the other detail about DixieCon that people need to know that's relevant to what you guys said is that except for the Sunday round, the games are unlimited time. So it's really much more about the fight over the stalemate line and whether someone can solo or not solo than it is trying to figure out how many, you know, centers you have at the end of 07 or 09. That's just not the way DixieCon works. So different, totally different environment. Karthik, let me move to you. You had the interesting experience in Carnage, you know, a week or two ago, of playing in a tournament in which there were 2 different scoring systems being used. They had Carnage scoring for 2 rounds, and they had Bangkok scoring for 2 rounds. So I'm sure that our viewers would be interested in your insights on how that went.
Sure. It was definitely a super fun tournament, really well run by David Miletsky. And the scoring system definitely created some interesting conundrums. So I think the first thing that would come up is it's a lot harder to tell where you are relative to the standings to everyone else when you're on the final board, because doing those percentile-based calculations, trying to map one scoring system to another and then combining them all into some final mathematical index, very, very difficult. So some of the metagame, like, you know, considerations that are very, very prominent in certain other tournaments where yours like, I am X many points away from the top board. I need this kind of results in order to make it. I'm willing to settle for such a result and ensure, like, you know, I'm willing to give someone else a board top. It means I get, like, you know, that high second place finish I need to make the top board. Those considerations kind of go out the window here because you have far less of ability to, like, you know, come to the conclusion of, oh, this is what I need. But then also what's really interesting is you get to play 2 different styles of games in the same tournament. So when you play the Carnage games, as we talked about before, you have a certain style of play that you will go for. Whereas in Bangkok, you'll find a game that plays more similar to Tribute, right? Because you get shares of a point pool based off of how far ahead of the second place person you are as a top player. So I think it's if you're in the lead, you get 3 shares of this 12-point pool, and then if you manage to make sure that you're 3 points ahead of, or 3 centers ahead of anyone else, you actually get all 12 of those points for yourself. So you can create massive point advantages. And when you normalize that thing to 100, because the point system only had a 41 for whatever reason, you're actually talking about like something like a 20-point swing if you normalize it to like a 100-point system. So getting those domination points are huge. Getting a lead over your second place compatriot is a big deal. Whereas in Carnage, you really only need to be 1 center ahead of your second place opponent. Anything above that doesn't really make a huge difference outside of maybe like, you know, a tiebreaker. But considering the fact that there were these percentile indexes in this tournament, those 1-point tiebreakers make even less of a difference than they normally do.
Interesting. Well, let me tell you guys that there's probably going to be more scoring systems coming. The virtual World Diplomacy Classic that's coming up in December is going to debut its own scoring system. So we'll have that to look forward to. Before we get there, let me just say for our final segment, maybe starting with you, David, can you give us some general advice on how you adapt to different scoring systems while also staying true to yourself as your in the way that you play diplomacy?
Yeah, I think when I'm playing my best, I don't really change how I play when there's a different scoring system. What I change, and I will say this, I'll die on this hill, diplomacy is not about the blocks and the dots, it's about the people. The only thing that I really try to change is how I'm reading other people and what I might think they do. I would bet, and I think Doug will agree with me here, him being one of these players I'm referring to, that the better players, the best players in the world, go into every game with a similar mindset, looking for that opportunity to make that big move, to go for the solo. They're not going into a game saying, "Oh, a second place would be nice." And so I think if no matter what scoring system you're playing under, it's really just playing the people, understanding their motivations, and understanding, okay, maybe you have some newer players and it's a new scoring system. They might be hesitant, or maybe they think they need to stab, and understanding how that's going to impact other players' play so that you can play your own game.
Yeah, I think that's good insight. Sometimes people describe the fact that we have different scoring systems in a way that's like professional tennis, where you've got some tournaments that play on hard court, you've got some tournaments that play on clay, and you've got some that play on the grass. And the really good players know how to adapt there. But it's mostly the same tennis game, but there's nuances that you can adapt to improve your play. Karthik, give us your final thoughts for our viewers on how to adapt to scoring systems as a player.
I generally agree with David on that point, that I generally like to play my own style of game. I come from an online DSS, that's draw size scoring, and a DIAS, as you said, draw include all survivors type of play. So I'm big on the whole whittling system, going for stalemate lines. I like to play a game either to a solo or to a solid stalemate line, and I want to be shown that stalemate line before I hit draw, ideally. And I'm glad that you feel the same way, David. So at least what I think.
I cannot wait to get you to Dixicon, Karthik. I love that.
Yeah, I think kindred spirits there. But I do adjust my play style to the type of tournament that we're playing, like, out of necessity in some cases. And I think even bigger than the scoring system sometimes is the time constraint. When you play a 1907 or a 1909 type game, the game is vastly, vastly different than a time unlimited game, despite being on the same board with the same otherwise rules. And I think I did make some mistakes at Carnage because I tried to play my own style of game despite it being a 1907 game, and sort of going along the lines and trying to break past the lines when it would have been more efficient to simply resolve my side of the board. I think that's a far better play in a sort of time unlimited game than trying to break across the line and go for a solo. So I think in terms of adaptation, the most important thing is to know exactly what you're playing for, know the considerations of your opponents, and then manage both of those to achieve the desirable result.
Yeah, that's a good insight about the time constraint. Doug, take us home here with your thoughts.
Thanks, David. I think that David Miller alluded to this. I don't change my game very much. I tend to play the same way with a few small caveats. The first is an understanding of incentives. The incentives offered to other players and what it looks like for them, and knowing what they're playing for is really important. And also the incentives of what am I playing for in this particular game. And so there's some nuance. And Karthik, I thought you did a really good job of talking about how your playstyle can play under a C Diplo or Bangkok system where there's a year end by date, so 1907, 1908, 1909. But also one of the factors in a tournament that is really crucial is whether or not there's a top board. Because up until then, you're sort of playing a game within a game if there's a top board at a tournament. Your goal is to make the top board so that you have an opportunity to win the tournament. And so really all you want to do is play to get big, try and top your board, build a solo opportunity, and then from there understand what smaller incentives there are for other players and for yourself to maximize your score. But frankly, there's not a lot of time when you're playing a game to really think about that. So that's why I try to keep it very simple. Focus on like, how do I get the best result here? And that's almost always by getting big. That's really all it is.
So your advice is get big on the diplomacy board.
pretty much.
That is insightful as always, Doug. No, seriously, I appreciate it, guys. I've enjoyed it. Hope you have too. And thanks for participating in our panel. And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly at davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.